Does your company have multi-million-dollar contracts? If so, then you will probably have to match the work section of the contract to the format of the American Institute of Architects when billing your client. This is the items list that we have been working with during the entire course. But let's quickly review what we learned in the prior video about how the items list is supposed to work in QuickBooks, and then we'll talk about how it relates to the billing requirements of the American Institute of Architects. If you have any questions about this topic, you can leave them in the comments section below and I'll do my best to help you. And of course, if you feel the video helped you, I hope you will click like and don't forget to subscribe to get updates on new videos that come out all the time. This is the items list that we have been working with during the entire course. But let's quickly review what we learned in the prior video about how the items list is supposed to work in QuickBooks, and then we'll talk about how it relates to the billing requirements of the American Institute of Architects. Now, this is the items list that we have been using for the course. And if you remember, we set these items up at the beginning of the course when we set up everything for your contractor file. If you remember, these items are connected to income accounts that you had put in the chart of accounts when you originally set up the file. And you need several income accounts in your chart of accounts if you want to see a detail of the income section of your profit and loss. If you look at a typical QuickBooks profit and loss report, the income section is on top and the expense section is below. And if you want to see each area that money is coming in from, you would have to create separate income accounts so that those accounts would show up at the top of the profit and loss and show you how much money came into each of those income accounts to get the total income and then eventually subtract out the expenses for the net income. Now, how does the flow of information work? Well, you start by putting these items on an estimate, because the estimate reflects the entire contract. And when you put the items on the estimate, it's at the beginning of the contract, so 100% of the amount you expect to bill for the entire contract is what gets listed on the original estimate. Then, when you bill the clients for each piece of the work that's done, you will only put on the items section of the invoice the amount of each item that was done during that specific phase of the job. And that's what you bill your client for. Now, in QuickBooks, the most important thing to remember is that it's the moment that you put the items on the invoice that the income accounts will increase. The income accounts do not increase when you create the estimate, and the income accounts do not increase when you finally get paid for the invoice. The income accounts that are connected to the items increase when you put the items on the invoice and save the invoice. So, where do they first come from? In other words, how do you decide what items to put on the estimate or invoice? Well, usually they come from a contract. And a contract, a written contract with a contractor for work to be done over several months, usually has several articles in the contract, and there are many pages of each contract. The most important section for purposes of this video is the section called Work of this Contract. That's really where you decide which items from your items list to put on the estimate and to put on the invoice and to bill in partial phases for progress invoicing. So These items, one by one, are actually explicitly stated on the contract. For example, under Article number 2, the first description of work might be carpentry, and that would be the name of the item. And then in the contract, you would have something called a subdescription. And it's the subdescription that's written directly under the description of the item of work that really explains exactly what will be done regarding that item for each phase of the contract. For example, mason work. That might be the name of your item, but that might be the description of the title of that piece of work in the contract. And then, of course, in the contract, mason work would have a subdescription that clearly explains physically what the person is going to receive from the contractor for that specific item that will be billed as one of the line items in the invoices. The main description is the name of the billed item in the item column of the invoice, but it's the subdescription. That's what you use to decide how much of the work is done, and the subdescription goes in the description field on the same line of the invoice as the name of the item. For example, if the work on this contract called for 2 items, mason work and carpentry, and this was the description of the exact mason work you're going to do, and this was a description of the exact carpentry that you're going to do, how would it look on the invoice? Well, the title, mason work, which is the description of that piece, would go in the item code or item name column. And then the subdescription in the contract is what would go on the same line in the description field of the invoice. So you can see which or how many items of work in each section of the work done in the description of the contract, and for each item you can clearly see in the description field exactly what the contractor is supposed to do in order to bill the client for that item of work. But then the question is, how do you know how much to bill for any particular phase of the job? Well, it's common sense. You would physically look at all of the work that had been done for that particular item since the last invoice. And you would count and you would use math, and then you would compare it to the subdescription exactly as it's written in the contract. And then you would decide for that particular invoice, for that part of the job, exactly how much to bill on that invoice, comparing the work to what it says on the job. Always consider what was billed in prior phases. We know that the estimate has 100% of each item listed for each item on the estimate. But if you only finished 25% of the work in phase 1, you could only bill for 25%. But be careful. When you finish the next phase of the contract, you have to consider how much work is done in the prior phase, and most often you're required to show on that invoice how much work was done in all the work that was done actually in the prior invoices, and the specific amount of work that was done in this phase, and then after this invoice, the percent of the job that was billed and assumed to be physically finished. And it's only when you get up to the last invoice of the job that you can clearly see that you finished 100%. So in this example, phase 3, 40% of the work was done in phase 3, but this phase 3 invoice should have a column that shows the prior 60% finished and also show 100% finished at the moment you bill the final invoice. Billing for physical contracts can be detailed and complex. People outside the contract may need to evaluate the contract but may not understand some of the details. It's safer to make a contract and the billing agreement in a standardized way. That's why our good friends at the American Institute of Architects have come up with a standardized way of classifying the different trade services and classifying the different items of service that they give, so contracts can be understood by objective parties and be a little bit more clear about each phase of the work done. Multi-million-dollar contracts often require billing in A.I.A format. It's easier to settle disputes objectively, and it's easier to determine the billable amounts. Contracts that are in the format from the American Institute of Architects, it's the work section of the contract that determines how the contract will be billed. And if you have multi-million-dollar contracts, you must send your job invoices to your clients in the specific format from the American Institute of Architects. This is a request for payment for that phase of the job. It must be exactly in the format of the template given for that type of contract. It must list each item being billed, the amount billed for, and the total billed in prior invoices for the same job and the same percent and amount completed to date. Usually, these forms are made with Excel because they have many lines of details and the format must be exact. The important point here is that you must send the bill in this format whether you use QuickBooks or not. And that means that you cannot use the invoices that come from QuickBooks. You can only record the same things in QuickBooks as you put in the A.I.A Excel sheet when you invoice the client. Invoices sent in A.I.A format can have many pages, but the most important page is what they call the continuation sheet, or schedule of values. Everyone has a different word for it. Notice it has everything that's required in an invoice when sent from the A.I.A format. Remember, you are required to show all the accumulated totals for each line for all the prior invoices that were sent when sending a new invoice in A.I.A format. And in order to know how much to bill for this phase of the job, you would do the same thing that you would do if you were using QuickBooks. You would look at the work to see the amount of work done since the last invoice, and then you would compare it to the description and subdescription in the contract, and then you would use a calculator and decide how much to bill for on this particular invoice for this phase of the job. The most important numbers are summarized on the last page of the official invoice sent. The summary section shows the 3 most important numbers that the client needs to look at when deciding to pay. It shows the original sum. It shows the sum after all change orders. Of course, it's going to show the retainage. And then finally, it shows the amount we're requesting that they pay on this particular invoice for this phase of the job. Now, if you're using A.I.A billing as well as QuickBooks, you have 2 choices. You could bill in the detailed way, or you could record into QuickBooks in the summary way. Now, the detailed way means that you take everything line by line that's on the continuation sheet and the schedule of values in the A.I.A bill and make sure that matches line by line in the QuickBooks file in the invoice that you record for that phase of the job. In both cases, you can put a percent complete or an amount, but it has to be exactly the same each line of the invoice matching each line of the continuation sheet in the Excel part of the bill that you send to the client. Now, remember what happens when we do progress invoicing. As soon as we choose a job with an estimate, this message pops up. And the choice you make if you're doing A.I.A billing and QuickBooks is the bottom choice here. Create invoice for selected items or for percentages of each item. When you make this choice, you will get this window. Specify invoice amounts for items on estimate. And it's this window, line by line, that you have to make match the bill that you're going to send in the format of the American Institute of Architects. They both allow you to put a percent complete or an amount complete, and they'll calculate the other if you put one. And you're able to put all the details that's in the continuation sheet from A.I.A into this window when you do progress invoicing and you want the invoices that you record in QuickBooks to be exactly the same as the invoices that you send to the client. There's another way that you can record it into QuickBooks. You can leave the details in the Excel sheet that you send to the client, and in your QuickBooks you could simply look at the last page of the bill and simply enter the 3 summary numbers that are the most important numbers in the last page. And only those 3 numbers would be the numbers that you would enter into QuickBooks when you make an estimate and when you make the succeeding invoices for that estimate, or the invoices that will follow in succession. And if you do that, I'm telling you, you will still get everything you need from QuickBooks. You will still be able to get everything. In fact, most of my contractors don't want a cluttered income section of their profit and loss, and don't want a whole bunch of income accounts in their chart of accounts. They're totally satisfied with having just one income account and one item on their items list, because as contractors, they have some clear understanding of where their money is coming in from, and the expenses and tracking them are the most important thing. You can still benefit from all of the QuickBooks features for contractors. You can still track profit and loss by job if you have only one item and one income account. You can still bill clients for checks and vendors' bills. You can still track time by job and by worker. And you can still see the job progress percent complete for your progress invoicing. Most contractors would prefer to have one income item on their items list and one income account in their chart of accounts and keep things simple. In fact, most contractors that I know don't want a whole bunch of detail in the income section of their profit and loss, and also don't need a whole bunch of income accounts in their chart of accounts. Most of them need only one income account and one item. If you do it this way in QuickBooks and leave the details in the continuation sheet from A.I.A, you can still benefit from all the QuickBooks features for contractors. You can still track profit and loss by job. You can still bill clients for checks and vendors' bills that are designated for those jobs. You can still track time by job and worker, and you can still see the percent complete of each job in your progress invoicing reports. So, it would be better for most of you to just put one item on your items list and have one income account show in your profit and loss, because most of you already know where your money comes in and how it comes in and who it comes in from. So the way to do the summary is to take these 3 numbers and make sure they get put as 2 simple items on the invoice. One item for earned, one item for retainage, and the invoice should show the same net due in the invoice in QuickBooks as a summary that it does on the last page of the bill from A.I.A. You can learn everything you need in QuickBooks regarding contractor features by watching the full playlist that this video is a part of. You can just click the link in the comment field or under the first paragraph in the description field, and there's also links in the top right of the video as it plays.